Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon's session explores a new book by Marvin Suesse of Trinity College Dublin entitled The Nationalist Dilemma, A Global History of Economic Nationalism, 1776 to the Present, published in July by Cambridge University Press. Joining us this afternoon is our discussant, Erica Rapoport of the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. For those of you who don't know, the seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association. And we've been exploring new scholarship since 2010. A few quick things before we get going. First, let me invite you to next week's session on December 4th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a session on a new book by Sarah Percy on Forgotten Warriors, The Long History of Women in Combat. Second, we'd like to thank two people whose hard work behind the scenes make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. Third, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function, in which case we call on you, you unmute, you pose the question yourself, or you can use the written Q&A function on Zoom, in which case Christian Osterman will pose your question for you. With those preliminaries out of the way, we can get the seminar fully going. Christian, the Zoom room, all yours.
Thanks, Eric, and good afternoon as well from me. Welcome to this Washington History Seminar session. Let me reiterate what Eric said about the seminar. It's a largely pro bono effort on the part of our two organizations. Tomorrow is Giving Tuesday. So if you enjoy the seminar, if you like to support a series like this, do go to our websites and donate to the Wilson Center History and Public Policy Program or the American Historical Association. Much appreciated. It's my great pleasure now to introduce first our featured speaker and then our distinguished commentator, and moderate this session. I hope that in the second part, as Eric mentioned, many of you will join, and we give preference to those who dare to join directly by calling in and posing your question or comment through join the conversation here in the Zoom room. Marvin Suesse is assistant professor in economics at Trinity College Dublin. He's currently the director of research of the Centre for Economics, Policy and History at CAPS Dublin, a joint effort of Trinity College and Queen's University Belfast. And he's also an expert in economic history and international political economy. He's the author of the book that we'll be talking about today, The Nationalist Dilemma, A Global History of Economic Nationalism, 1776 to present, published early this year by Cambridge University Press. He has previously published on the relationship between globalization and state formation in the 20th century Africa, market integration and financialization in Imperial Germany, and regional integration in the former Soviet Union. Wonderful to have you here, Marvin. I'll be introducing our commentator a little later on. The Zoom room is all yours, Marvin.
Thank you so much, Eric and Christian, for this very kind introduction. And thanks to the Wilson Center and the HAA, and especially also to Rachel Wheatley for corresponding with me and for helping to organize this session. So it's a real honor to be here and to talk a bit about my book, The Nationalist Dilemma, and especially look forward to Erica's comments and hopefully fruitful discussion later on. And on this occasion, I'm actually very glad that Erica has received the book, because I was giving a presentation a few weeks back at a seminar in Denmark, where the discussant did not actually receive their particular copy because, quite fitting for a work on economic nationalism, the book got stuck in customs. In this case, these were the new customs barriers that have been put in place between the book's physical place of production in Cambridge, UK, and my potential consumers on the European continent after Brexit. And phenomena such as Brexit are, of course, what many people associate with this phrase, economic nationalism. We associate a fragmenting world of increasing isolation and ever higher barriers to the exchange of goods, capital, people, and even ideas, something that we often today also call deglobalization. Many people are concerned about that. Yet, while this isolationist phenomenon is an important facet of economic nationalism, this theme alone is not sufficient, in my view, to understand the varied ways in which nationalists may approach and apply economic concepts. One core argument of the book is that we have to understand economic nationalism in a global context rather than in isolation. And that is why I've chosen to write, as the book subtitle indicates, an explicitly global history. And there are at least two elements that make a global frame, in my view, indispensable when it comes to studying the way nationalist movements approach economic questions. And I should note that this is in essence the definition I'll be employing here, right? Economic nationalism is what nationalists think and do about economic affairs. Now, first, the book talks a lot about how nationalists have influenced each other intellectually over the past 250 years, and have even sometimes cooperated in formulating their ideas. And this is what gives these ideas a global aspect. So a key figure in the development of an explicitly nationalist tradition of thought was Friedrich List, an economist born in the German Duchy of Baden in 1789. And he's nowadays often called a German economist. And although he was indeed an ardent German nationalist, this characterization of his thinking is somewhat misleading. So List emigrated to the US in 1825, mingled in high policy circles there, met many important people, obtained American citizenship. When he returned to Europe in the early 1830s, he spent many years in France, similarly engaged in what one might now call public advocacy or public policy consulting even. When he finally settled back in Germany, his ideas about national economies as a vehicle for growth and development reflected the influence of French thinkers, such as the Comte du Chaptal, but even more decisively that of American thinkers, such as Alexander Hamilton and Daniel Raymond. And I argue, therefore, in the book that many of his ideas were of explicitly American origin, although seen through the lens of a German nationalist. List's writings, that is, the centrality of a national economy over individual welfare, and the policies such as tariffs and credit and infrastructure expansion that he associated with that, those policies were then once again exported, or one might say re-exported, after List's death in 1846 to be adopted by nationalist movements around the world. So a very significant part of the book analyzes how nationalists in countries as diverse as Argentina, Romania, Russia, India, Ireland, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan, in turn, reinterpreted Listian thinking and attempted to make policy on this basis. And I should also stress that this was very much an acknowledged process by nationalist agitators and thinkers at the time. They were very open about the foreign sources of their ideas. And that's something that always continued to amaze me as I read the writings of this period, is that you have situations where, for example, Arthur Griffith, the founder of the Irish Sinn Féin party, which is of course still very much active here on this island, could publicly declare in 1905, presenting what he called the Sinn Féin program, that after independence, Irish economic policy should directly, quote, follow Friedrich List. Now, the reasons for nationalists to imitate each other so closely are complex and are often highly context specific, but in many cases, the desire to import legitimacy from visibly successful economy building project, such as the German one in the late 19th century, was important for new and often fledgling nationalist movements. Now, if we were to only focus, I think, on the national movements in each of these countries that I've just mentioned, we would be missing this process of cross-pollination, translation, and reinterpretation. And I think this is a really important point to emphasize here, that as globalization accelerated over the 19th century and people and ideas traveled faster and more frequently, so did nationalist ideas. So then we can see similar processes, although arguably less explicitly, during the acceleration of globalization in the late 20th century too. And here nationalists often look to models such as that of the so-called East Asian developmental state, the supposed economic model followed by Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan after the 1950s, which in this case were then held to be the paragons of what a national economy should aspire to be like. So in other words, the spread of ideas surrounding the importance of an explicitly national economy was paradoxically an outcome of globalization. Now, second reason why a global frame is important is because globalization in its multifaceted impacts often exerted broadly similar pressures on regions across the world. So economic historians refer to a great divergence, making the world economy of the 19th century increasingly unequal as industrial production in the North Atlantic economies forged ahead. And this gave rise in the 19th century to narratives about the backwardness and underdevelopment of the global South. And while the book, of course, does not endorse those narratives themselves, it is important to recognize that they were often taken up by nationalist movements in the global South themselves, who then set out to vindicate national honor by trying to spur the kind of catch-up industrialization that they hoped would place their nation on an equal footing with the advanced nations of Europe and North America. And this is a very potent theme that runs through the writings of many nationalist politicians and thinkers. So an example of this, for example, Sun Yat-sen, the first president of the Republic of China. And you see similar trends in the writings and speeches of many self-described modernizers in post-Second World War Latin America and post-colonial Africa. For example, Kwame Nkrumah being an example of the latter. Now, in other cases, globalization accentuated differences in income or wealth, not so much between countries or between nations, but between different groups within a society. And this then often led to nationalists worrying about globalization presenting a threat to national unity. For example, Argentinian nationalists of the interwar period worried that the country's traditional exports of grain and beef, as well as the concurrent investment by British companies, especially in railway infrastructure, had made landowners disproportionately rich, whereas the urban proletariat in Buenos Aires had not reaped those gains, and that this would fragment the nation economically, tear the nation apart. And we can try and understand the policies then by populists such as Juan Perón as attempts to try and mend this internal fragmentation by attempting to contain Argentina's international exposure and thereby, in a way, cutting those elites off from the global transnational sources of their wealth. And this is, at the very least, how Perón's regime often presented itself and arguably constituted one of the ideological basis of its support. So the Peronist invectives against oligarchs who sold out their homeland, that was kind of a literal phrase that was often used, were therefore both reflected domestic politics, domestic inequality, as well as a program calling for international isolation. And we find remarkably similar rhetoric employed by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, between 1956 and 1970. So nationalist programs for economic policy, therefore, because they often reflect responses to similar globalization pressures, often contain elements that are comparable in some sense. And this, I hope, can also serve somewhat to demystify those nationalist narratives. Because as many people have, of course, already pointed out, nationalist myths are seldom unique, nor are they deeply rooted in an ancient past. But as the book underlines as well, they are the result of both structural forces of global change, as well as this process of intellectual borrowing that I've described. Now, moreover, as I think is evident from a lot of these cases, nationalist thinking on the economy follows a certain logic, exhibits certain patterns that allows us to investigate the origin and evolution of nationalist programs. And the global history theme of the book therefore contains a strong comparative element. So in the example that I've just mentioned, there's one section that compares the genesis of ideas of both Argentina's Perón and Egypt's Nasser in one section. And this allows me to isolate those factors that were decisive in giving rise to similar policy programs in otherwise quite dissimilar contexts. So in some sense, I think, therefore, the work builds on a long tradition of scholars, including luminaries such as Ernest Gell and Benedict Anderson, who paid attention to structural factors of economic and social change in engendering nationalist ideas. Yet it tries to combine this with an attention to the influence of intellectual discourses and ideas emphasized by many scholars, for example, Partha Chatterjee. And as I argue, ideas, intellectual traditions, and discourses have provided vital lenses through which historical actors have viewed and interpreted structural economic challenges and opportunities. In addition to this, I also place emphasis on the role of historical contingency, chance, and coincidence. So very often, nationalist ideas on the economy were of very marginal importance until an economic depression, financial crisis, or an armed conflict seemed to provide empirical validation of those nationalist views. And this then eased the popularization of their positions. So there certainly is nothing predetermined about nationalist ideas, about the economy becoming powerful. Right? This is often a very contingent process. And in my view, one of the main benefits of really taking a long-term historical perspective, as I try and do in this book, is precisely because this allows us to observe the interplay of economic structure, of ideas and agency, as well as chance. And a good example of this, I think, is the swing from free trade and the exports of cash crops towards policies of protectionism and industrialization in interwar Brazil. So this is one of the cases explored in the book. And of course, structural factors in this case matter because there had, over the long 19th century and the early 20th century, been an increasing gap in income per capita between Brazil and the North Atlantic economies. And this then, of course, gave potential for industrialist ideas to gain ground. So this potential existed. Yet this structural change or these structural conditions by themselves were not sufficient really to give a large following to industrialist ideas until, firstly, the Great Depression discredited existing models of economic and political order, ending the old republic in the revolution of 1930. So that's in a way the contingency part. There's almost an external shock that dislodges existing equilibria, opens up space, changes institutions. And then secondly, you have a transfer, a change in discourse and the transmission of ideas as the ideas of foreign nationalist economists, in this case, that of especially the Romanian economist Mihail Manulescu, start to circulate in Brazil. And this provides autocrats such as Getulio Vargas with a menu of ideas and options that he can then choose from and employ. So all those three factors, how they work together, I think is one of the main benefits of the methodological lens that I employ in this book. Now, of course, this methodological framework has implications for the way that I tell the stories in this book. And I think there is a large emphasis on the internal tensions and contradictions, or to use the title of the book, the dilemmas that characterize nationalist economic programs. And these dilemmas, these tensions arise because nationalist programs for change often run against structural constraints, be they political or economic or social or otherwise. The most obvious tension is one that I have already touched upon, and that is the foreign origin of many nationalist ideas. For example, in Imperial Russia, listed ideas were imported by technocrats such as Sergei Witte, who was the empire's finance minister in the 1890s, and who wrote a tract explicitly endorsing listed ideas and saying, this is what we're going to do. Our policy is going to, again, very openly based on List's ideas. And this did not sit well with everyone. And those ideas encountered strong domestic opposition in the form of more nativist ideas propagated by intellectuals, which are often kind of bunched together in what one might call a Slavophile tradition. And those could allege that the import of German, American ideas, whatever, into Russia was distinctly un-Russian. And this illustrates, I think, how important competition between nationalist groups on the economy may be. And I hope this encourages us to somehow unpack this apparent monolith. Right? There is no one economic nationalism, but there are often these contrasting and often warring factions within this big tent. And I think these kind of conflicts drive a lot of nationalist policy making. Another tension is, I think, the need for nationalist programs, if they are to be politically successful. And like most political movements, in the end, nationalists want to influence policy to some degree. And if they want to do this, they need to cater to the preferences and interests of some influential groups within society. And this process of selection and adaptation in turn molds and alters these programs, often in decisive ways, and again serve to reinterpret the ideas of certain writers. So again, one example of this, I would argue, are the ideas of Indian nationalists of the 1890s, who placed a lot of emphasis on analyzing the economic underpinnings of British rule in India, and then analyzing how an independent India would economically do much better. And one of the prime exponents of this is Dadabhai Naoroji and his drain theory. And I argue that if you look at his theory closely, Naoroji was not unambiguously opposed to international exchange. It was rather how his ideas were later reinterpreted, largely during the process of mass mobilization, which followed the Swadeshi campaigns, so kind of campaigns that emphasized the idea of patriotic consumption from 1905 onwards, that this reinterpretation, this popularization gave his ideas a much more inward looking slant. Now, the most salient dilemma, however, and this is the one that really gives the book its title, is the conflict between different nationalist goals. And most nationalists, I argue, pursue two objectives. One objective is the championing of strict isolation, and the other one, the advocacy of industrial growth. And it turns out that both of these are an essential part of nationalist thinking. And they're, of course, in some way very closely connected to each other, right? The the isolationist strand seeks to protect the national economy by insulating it from foreign disturbances, while the industrialist strand believes that if you want to protect the national economy, you need to make it strong and powerful. And this, in nationalist eyes, is to be accomplished through industrialization. Now, the problem for nationalists, and again, this is the dilemma, the title of the book really, is that it is difficult to fulfill both of these aims at the same time. This difficulty is heightened because the objective of industrialization, the desire to industrialize, to be a modern developed nation, etc., is most pronounced in nationalist movements at the so-called periphery of the world economy, exactly those regions that tend to be poorer. Yet it is exactly here that the need for foreign capital, for foreign machines and technology from abroad is the highest if industrialization is to be achieved. And therefore, isolation here is much more costly. And this book provides many examples of this dilemma. And I also provide textual evidence that many nationalists have indeed realized that there exists a trade-off between isolation and industrial expansion. One illustration of this that I think serves quite nicely here is Deng Xiaoping's so-called opening of China in the late 1970s. And Deng's argument was based on saying, well, China's isolation from global trade and investment during Mao Zedong's rule had left the country poor and weak. And Deng's argument was that opening up would give China access to the capital and the technology that it needed to modernize and become a powerful and advanced nation and on a par with the West. And he was, I would argue, in his goal of catching up with the West and undoing this century of humiliation, as much a nationalist as Mao. But he recognized that by the 1970s, China's isolation had become the cause of its weakness rather than the cure, and they advocated for openness on that basis. Now, this did not mean that Deng, or indeed the remainder of the CCP, became textbook free traders. They still sought to balance openness to foreign direct investment with, at the same time, trying to isolate key sectors of the economy for several decades after 1978 and arguably until today. They have used an array of joint venture legislation, special economic zones, exclusion for strategic industries, and subsidy regimes to this end. And it is exactly this attempt to balance some measure of openness with other measures that try and privilege isolation rather than full-blown autarky that I think is really the hallmark of nationalist economic policy making. Now, these compromises between isolation, industrialization, isolation, and openness are the result of particular contexts. Now, and if these contexts change, then policy can shift again, either further towards openness or back towards isolation. And this realization has large implications for understanding the situation we find ourselves in today. This brings me to the final point I would like to make. So the so-called opening of China after 78 and the liberalization of many other formerly protected economies during the 1980s and 1990s has led to the belief among policymakers and pundits, mainly in the West, that this would lead to a triumphal march of free market economics, where personal liberty and individual consumption would be the ultimate goals. But what many have failed to appreciate is that these openings were often just a shift of emphasis within nationalist approaches, and that many policymakers, especially, but not exclusively in the global South, never embraced free markets as a goal in themselves, but merely as a temporary expedient towards this dream of national wealth and power. And in particular, during the 2000s, as I argue in the book's penultimate chapter, Chinese leaders started to see China's imports of Western technology as a new form of dependency. And they feared that China would never be able to close the gap with the US if it remained specialized in labor-intensive textiles and mass-produced electronics. In addition, the global financial crisis of 2007-2008 was interpreted by many in the Chinese leadership as showing the weaknesses of Western models of globalized financial capitalism. And as the perceived risks from openness increased and its gains or the appreciation of those gains receded, policy swung back towards isolation again to a greater degree. Starting with Hu Jintao, but more concertedly under Xi Jinping, the CCP therefore started to promote industrial policies that protected and supported Chinese manufacturing enterprises in high-tech sectors, trying to move away from this labor-intensive model of exports. And the most notable of those industrial policy programs was the Made in China 2025 program, which arguably constitutes one of the boldest attempts at directed catch-up growth since the 1970s. This program, in turn, triggered protectionist reactions in other parts of the world, in the EU and India, but most decisively, of course, in the US, where it was one of the factors, by no means the only one, but one of the factors that eventually led to the escalation of the US-China trade war with Trump, and to some extent also the current policies of decoupling promoted by the Biden administration. And this is the final interpretation of the nationalist dilemma explored in the book, that the pursuit of nationalist policies by one group or one state often poses a dilemma to other groups or states and can lead to retaliatory reactions of the kind that we have seen during the commercial conflicts of the interwar period, as well as today. And in the end, I would argue that if we are to make sense of these situations, it is important to realize that nationalists do think about the economy, and that nationalism is not just a purely political or cultural ideology, but also one that is imminently concerned with questions of consumption, of economic development, of exchange and investment. Once we realize this, we may be better equipped to understand the motivations of some key historical actors as well as current policymakers. I think I will stop here, and I very much look forward to Erica's comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marvin. Terrific. That was very clear and thoughtful, even for a non-economic audience. We're delighted to welcome to the Washington History Seminar Erica Rappaport, professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on modern British history and imperial history, women's and gender history, and global histories of capitalism and empire. She received her PhD in history from Rutgers University in 1993. Her most significant publications include Shopping for Pleasure, Women in the Making of London's West End, published by Princeton in 2000, and The Thirst for Empire, How Tea Shaped the Modern World, published by Princeton in 2017, which won the American Historical Association's 2018 Jerry Bentley Prize for the best book dealing with global or world scale history. She's also the co-editor of Consuming Behaviors, Identities, Politics, and Pleasure in 20th Century Britain, Bloomsbury 2015, and editor of A Cultural History of Shopping in the Age of Revolution and Empire, also published by Bloomsbury in 2022. She's currently writing a book tentatively entitled Talking Points: How Public Relations Sold the End of Empire, which examines how the British public relations industry managed the process, understanding, and memories of decolonization. Erica, it's wonderful to have you with us. The Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you so much. And I really want to thank the organizers of the seminar for inviting me to comment on what is really an extraordinary, very significant, really stimulating book, Marvin. So thank you very much for writing that book as well. So I think this is a book that's going to be read, discussed, critiqued, built upon by historians, economists, political scientists, and policymakers for years to come. Not least of all because it's so carefully, it's beautifully written, I have to say, and it's so prescient in its questions, approaches, and conclusions. And it's just so rich, I can imagine dipping into it again and again for the different sections, time periods, etc. So I also want to thank you for that really wonderful summary of the book's main points and some of its conclusions. So when I was first, though, invited to comment on the book, I was very excited and a little bit confused, and I'll explain. So like most people living through this era, I've been struggling to understand the power of economic nationalists to forge political coalitions from across this political spectrum in so many countries today, including the country that I study most directly, Great Britain. So I hoped, of course, that this book was going to help me understand Brexit and help me teach my 20th century British history course, and I'm not disappointed. It really does do that. So, but my confusion comes in a way because my area of expertise, I realized because I'm a British historian, it's, economic nationalism is less of a prominent theme than it is in some other nations. There have, of course, been British economic nationalists, and many of them appear in this book. But in general, Britain looms as economic nationalist other, or as Dr. Suesse puts it in a discussion he was writing about the July Revolution in France, this wonderful phrase, the bête noire in this story, as usual, was Britain. So as a scholar of what Frank Trentman called the free trade nation, I have spent much of my career writing, I realize and have to admit, about globalizers, though I've never really consciously thought about it in quite the same way. So I've written about large-scale businesses, advertisers, retailers, manufacturers who created global markets and global consumer-based identities as a means typically to further their own industries. So this book really encouraged me to rethink some of my underlying assumptions of the people and topics I work on. So for example, tea growers in the 1930s were desperate to globalize markets and increase tea consumption. They developed a global ad campaign that relied on national stereotypes. So for example, they marketed tea by using a skier in Sweden, a lumberjack in Canada, and a football player in the United States. So when I worked on this campaign, I focused on the global structures of the campaign and global advertising. What I didn't do was focus on the construction of a national consumer citizen that is obviously there as well. So this book, I think, challenges all scholars, but myself included, to consider, I think, the underlying national ideologies and strategies that enable global capitalism to thrive. So kind of flipping your formulation on its head. So for today's comment, I think I want to briefly summarize your arguments, remark on the method that is in this book, and then consider some questions from the point of view of a British cultural gender historian, still thinking about it, not asked to do more, but to open up the discussion and think about how I read the book. So in the Nationalist Dilemma, Suesse illuminates the benefits of studying economic nationalism from a global and a historical perspective. He employs both a comparative and connective model of world history to analyze the context and influences of key writers and texts in a remarkable number of places and time periods. And yet it has such coherence. So it's really incredible, the breadth and depth and coherence. So the book synthesizes also a huge body of scholarship to distill key patterns. So all of the economic nationalists in this book believe that the nation and economy should be congruent. Yet to achieve this aim, economic nationalists developed two different but not wholly distinct models of political economy, what are called expansionist and isolationist. The differences and tensions among these strands are, in a way, the nationalist dilemma. So the author then shows how intellectuals, policymakers, politicians, activists chose ideas from what he calls a common menu. Then we see how this common menu was shared across dramatically different political time periods, spaces, and political views. So the book in general gives equal consideration, as you write, to writers and politicians that most of us would find morally objectionable, as well as those we might admire. So it's very balanced, but also showing how all of these people are part of this shared conversation. So an important theme in the book, which I think shapes the book's methods and conclusions, is also an insistence that we can't separate ideas from interests, such as that of class or a particular segment of society. Obviously, this is a challenge to Marxist political economy and other approaches that rely on social groupings or something like religion or ethnicity or particular business interests, such as financiers versus, manufacturers, that sort of thing. So none of those things can alone explain policies or why authors and politicians would pick among this common menu. The book does look at mass movements. Generally speaking, these are consumer boycotts or consumer-based movements, but is not primarily concerned with how economic nationalists sought popular support. It gives us, though, clues about the process by focusing on why economic nationalists developed their arguments within specific historical contexts. So rather than developing an economic model as such, the book looks through a series of case studies to show, I think, three main things. One is how and which variants of ideas emerged at a particular moment and place, and how they specifically travel across time and space. It also looks at how local as well as structural factors interact to shape this kind of intellectual history, or maybe common menu. And then it really makes an important argument that we have to say to ourselves over and over again, which is that economic nationalists are not backward looking. Their ideas aren't just vague, or they're not merely opportunists, choosing ideas for to gain power, but rather economic nationalists and the ideologies that are being discussed in this book provide answers to deep-seated questions about ultimately the relationship between economies, social structures, and states. So using a fascinating set of examples and almost a dizzying, fascinating, each chapter has amazing comparisons that are really surprising, and I love that. So you look at, explore the historical context then which shape economic nationalists, these kind of key debates about the size of states, what are the optimal size of states in terms of things like markets and resources, where and how borders could be drawn, and how permeable these borders should be. While all nationalists debated who belonged in the nation, economic nationalists considered the role of the state in expanding or contracting the movement of people, goods, services, technologies, and the like. So some do hearken back to a kind of imagined economy of peasant self-sufficiency, but many were resolutely modern and hailed the virtues of industrial and technical development. Such desires, as we've just heard about, were often in conflict with one another. And I think, as Suesse puts it so clearly in the introduction, this is a quote: "The effort by nationalists to overcome this dilemma is the core determinant of national policy making." So again, that dilemma that we've been discussing. So the book's narrative is chronological and moves generally from intellectual to policy history. It begins and ends in the United States without assuming US global dominance, either in economic or intellectual terms. So it's kind of a clever narrative in that way. The book starts in the early Republican US, in part because it's a key space where economic nationalism emerged and became a model for states that were in the making, such as 19th century Germany, or I think, now, this is my British historian's take. I focus especially on the states in the post-World War II era. They're also, like the early US, wrestling from independence from Britain. And, so that kind of post-colonial stance is sort of a theme throughout that I saw, that the book, though, isn't organized around that. So, but throughout the book, we see useful comparisons among a varied number of anti-colonial movements and post-colonial state building projects in India, Ireland, Ghana, Egypt, Tanzania, Israel, and Malaysia, for example. So we have leaders like Parnell, Gandhi, and Nkrumah Nasser developing a left-leaning economic nationalism that critiqued liberal imperialism. But then those ideas develop and sort of are carried over in different forms in more recent movements, for example, in the protests against the World Bank, the IMF, or Bolivia's desire to protect its natural resources and indigenous values from predatory multinational corporations. So throughout the book, we see how nationalist thought was very adaptable. And so, for example, and also then always kind of in conflict with itself. So in the post-World War II era, also we see, for example, post-colonial states casting development plans as an extension of anti-imperial politics, but then running into the practical difficulties involved in major, say, infrastructure projects like dam building, which often led to compromises in which nationalist projects had to rely on foreign aid and foreign expertise. So those kinds of things come out throughout the book. So there's so much in this book, I can only scratch the surface. So I just want to raise some thoughts for further discussion. And this is not in any way meant for you to do more at all. This book is just beautifully complete, but it raises questions for scholars. And again, I'm sure economists will have a different set of questions, but I wanted to ask them from the point of view of, British historian, and for other disciplines, especially history and political science, to take up questions raised by the book and think more about, in general, why such ideas gain mass support. So that's not, kind of a key point of the book, but also, so why they gain mass support and why they have had such staying power. So first of all, to think about, we see how critical thinkers, most importantly, the German turned American economist Friedrich List, traveled beautifully through social, educational, and other kind of diasporic networks. And as we see, global developments both spread his and other economic nationalist thought. But I wonder if we could consider further, what were the popular or more popular associational networks that also gave support to such ideas? So not like mass support, but those kind of associational institutions that also take up these ideas and make them seem more common sense or, usable. So there's some of this in the book, but it would be a fruitful line of further research, or how, I was thinking kind of how you might point to how we could develop this kind of line of thought. And in general, I think there's a kind of interesting conclusion in the book in which, well, it is sort of, it would help us kind of think about these ideas in terms of key factors in the conclusion of the book that you say shaped whether economic nationalists took on expansionist or isolationist strands. And so in the conclusion, you write that the expansionist strand came primarily from the perception of international equality, that is between nations, a sense of inequality in that way. And then the isolationist strand was primarily a reaction to social inequalities within the nation. So here's a question, it's a kind of difficult one, it's going even another level, it's kind of going to another layer. So for our discussion, we could think a little bit more about how understandings of inequality emerged historically. So scholars, for example, have pointed out how the historical settings which gave rise to the invention of key economic terms, measures such as GDP or population or cost of living, scarcity, abundance, and the like. So perhaps further work could explore how the people in this book, that is the economic nationalists here, contributed to the making and not just using of these categories. So how they're picking up on particular categories to create economic thought, again, sort of go a level back. And in that sense, I'm kind of thinking, I was just curious what you thought about how your work demonstrates how these building blocks to what we think are measurements of the economy are invented as much as the nation. So we're used to saying, the nation is an invented category. It's a little harder for us to think through as economy as an invented category. So but maybe we could play with that idea a little bit. So this is a completely unfair question, but one that has plagued me since graduate school, and probably reflects my training in part by Victoria de Grazia. So just to kind of put it in a totally different frame, but future cultural historians, I think, might use your same method of using this comparative and connected method of study to think about the gendered and racialized rhetoric and policies, which often, but not always, accompany economic nationalist thought. So in this book, there's a beautiful way in which migration policies are seen as central to economic nationalist regimes and taken as part of this mix of economic nationalist thinking. But I wonder if historians might also take up things like family and reproductive policies, labor politics, social welfare as also central and not peripheral to the kind of choices that nationalists make. So in other words, our abortion restrictions and family policies, we have to take them seriously as part of economic nationalist thinking. And so, for example, Mussolini's autarky and his welfare and family policies, such as a bachelor tax or family allowance, really could be really fruitful for other historians to kind of think more carefully. Again, it's not just about gaining votes or a particular population crisis. So I just think that many scholars, have done sort of elements of this, but we could think a lot more and go back and do a gendered reading of these economists. I think it'd be fun. I don't know about others, but so I'll just conclude then to think about how attending to how economists and policymakers actually produce notions of the economy and how they carry with them inherent notions about ideals of race, gender, ethnicity, family, might help us understand the mass appeal of these economic ideals and why, as Dr. Suesse writes in a kind of very somber final sentence, I thought I'd quote it to you, and then we could use that to open our discussion. So the final sentence reads, "While many will regret its presence, economic nationalism is here to stay." So again, thank you for such a wonderful book, and I hope we have a great discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rappaport, for really excellent, thoughtful comments. Before I give Marvin the chance to respond and take your time to respond to these 3 or 4 sets of questions, very, very good questions. I'd like to encourage our attendees, our viewers, to join the conversation by either using the raise hand function or posting a comment in the Q&A function of Zoom. No question is too small or too big. This is your chance, and please do join us. Marvin, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Erica, for a wonderful discussion and for many wonderful and I think quite fruitful thoughts. So I think the first one that you raised at the very start of your review, where are the British? That's something that I struggled with myself as well as I was writing this book, or not just the British, but I think liberal economic thought in general, right? I think because in a way what the book does, it views economies, economic thought, basically through the eyes of what the economic nationalists in the book are saying, right? And as such, we view Britain's position in the world economy and also liberal economic thought only in a very, very one-dimensional way, right? We basically only view it from basically through the straw man and the boogeyman in a way that that List and his fellows are building up. So I think that is one, in a way, maybe health warning that maybe should be somewhere in the introduction, somewhere that please don't give this to your students to study British history or the evolution of classical or neoclassical economic thought. And in a way, I think it raises an interesting question as well, to what degree this, we call it a battle of ideas, or development of nationalist ideas on the economy, often rely to a very great extent on creating this image of the other, right? And often typecasting Britain and Adam Smith, and actually to much lesser degree David Ricardo. So it's always Adam Smith who gets the butt of most of the attacks by those economic nationalists, and create them as the ultimate other. And I argue, I think somewhere that this has a lot to do with the high visibility that both Smith and of course the British economy and the British Empire had during this period. So it was, if you wanted to attribute anything that was wrong in the world to a small set of actors, then these were the ones that you were going for. So they're in part, I think, rhetorical devices that nationalists could use for marketing in a way their creed. I think that connects maybe a little bit to the other point that you raised about mass support, and to some degree the institutional foundations of mass support. And I think one interesting theme here is that there is this kind of co-evolution, I would say, between associations and micro institutions and economic nationalism. So one very important set of institutions are of course, general lobby institutions, lobby associations that often become rapid consumers and eventually producers of nationalist economic thought, repackage it, use it for, as you mentioned, coalition formation. And then also often local voluntary associations. So one theme that kind of struck me when I was working on this, which I think could be fleshed out much more, is the role of cooperatives in this process. And you see that again in a lot of different contexts where associations like credit cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, that really are in many, many places are mass movements in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. They become progenitors of nationalist thought. And you see this very strongly in Central and Eastern Europe. You see it in the Habsburg lands, in Prussian Poland, where those local cooperatives are often used by local minorities, by Poles, by Hungarians, by Czech, by Romanian nationalists, and by German nationalists as well, to try and organize production, consumption, credit, etc., along national lines. You also, of course, see that in many anti-colonial movements, those associations, they really form, in a way, not even the backbone, but really some of the pioneers of anti-colonial movements. So Ghana is a case in point where you have these big cocoa boycotts that really leads to these bottom-up associations forming that then become one of the kind of driving forces behind early anti-colonial movements. And there is really, I think, a two-way relationship here, where those institutions grow as they adopt these ideas, and they adopt these ideas to grow further. I think the other point about statistics and of how we see the economy is absolutely fascinating. So I think this is really, really rich ground for further study. And often I think what happens is that, often these statistics are produced by central, sometimes by imperial states, right? With the aim of bringing objectivity to economic debates, and to some way kind of maybe reifying their particular position on economic relations. But then this very often, I think, has the opposite effect, right? Where then actually you see nationalist movements taking those statistics in a way and running with them with their own interpretations. So I think one example of this are the Chinese customs statistics, right, which then really become, in a way, a kind of a go-to for early Chinese nationalists to then really focus on the balance of trade. Say, look, the balance of trade is negative. Right? That's what all those statistics are showing. And then they spin, in a way, a whole economic theory that explains why the balance of trade is negative and how this is really bad for China, for the Chinese nation. Another example that people have examined to some extent already is the statistics published by the Soviet authorities in the late 1980s, where the relations between the Soviet republics was the economic relations as well as historical political relations were a big bone of contention for local separatist nationalist movements. And Soviet authorities, they always made this point of publishing statistics that showed how strong cross-border links were within the Soviet Union, right? How much Georgia was really dependent upon, Russian oil and gas and etc., and how these economies could not function without each other. It's a way of trying to keep the Soviet Union together to stop these centrifugal tendencies. But for local separatist movements, they took those statistics and said, look, basically what these are showing is that we export too much oil to Georgia, or, we import too much fruit from Georgia or something like this. So the statistics could then be used to, in a way, accentuate local grievances and actually give credence to calls for national independence. So I think there are very interesting kind of feedback loops that are at work here that are definitely worth exploring. And then the third point. So yeah, I think a gendered history of economic nationalism would be, I think, quite eye-opening. So it's something that kind of props up on the margins, I think, of the book in some circumstances, right, where you have nationalist movements that put a large emphasis on nationalist consumption, and this then often involves certain stereotypes involving women as then in the role of shoppers, housewives, etc., in making consumption decisions, right? Whereas, of course, men, they're usually then deemed to be the breadwinners, so they're kind of on the production side of the nationalist ledger, so to speak. But the degree to which this evolved, and then I think especially, as you mentioned, in post-Second World War, Europe fed into conceptions of the welfare state, I think would be absolutely fascinating. So I think if I could add a few more sections, then one section would definitely be about the construction of post-World War II European welfare states.
Great, thank you, Marvin. Erica, any rejoinders?
No, I love those answers. It was really exactly what I was thinking about, how kind of fun it was to read this book with Britain as kind of a straw man ghost sort of throughout the entire book, which was really interesting. And I think would be really fun to teach with, kind of a British, looking at kind of classical liberal understandings of the economy. So that was great. And it also made me just think, I was thinking about the gendered history, and I just thought how kind of in practical terms, I tend to read not economists, but business people of various sorts, and how they struggle with these very ideas on a kind of more day-to-day basis, I guess you would say, in terms of like many of them will want to have like merchandise marks where, you say this product has a national brand, it comes from a certain place. And they're always, they run into the problem every time of consumers, both working class people who don't want to pay more for the national brand, they really want the cheapest good, or they're very worried about female consumer desires, particularly women, because they imagine those are more irrational. So for example, in the Nazi state, in Nazi economic policies, irate when young women will purchase French fashions, so just the way in which like the struggle about gender, it would really be fun to explore more on that level, that it comes up in so many different ways. But you made me want to go back and really read the economists and policymakers. So that says a lot. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you, though.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead, Marvin.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. In a way, I think you could even spin the story a little bit further if you look at 18th century discourses about the imports of luxuries, right? Which, where was a huge debate, century, etc., about how female consumers, by importing French lace and stockings and silks, that they would ruin the British economy. And that was also a big topic of concern for concerned elder statesmen in the 19th century.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, it's funny again how then France operates in that discussion too, as a different kind of model or ghost. So yeah, luring people away from their duties as nationalists,
Great, thank you. Marvin, some people in our audience might wonder, how do you write a global history? Could you talk just a little bit about how you went about this project and, your sources? A lot of it is discourse history, but talk a little bit about your sources. I think we shouldn't take for granted that people know how these histories are done. And secondly, if you could also just carve out a little bit your historiographical intervention. You're not the first to write about the subject. Could you just sort of give us just a glimpse at the intervention that you're making in the literature? We don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I think it's important to note this. And then I'll turn it over to Eric for a question or two.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's never one way to write history such as these, and definitely if any other person would have been given this brief to some extent, right, they think it would have a very, very different book. I think one starting point is to kind of be aware of one's own limitations, right? And those limitations come from partially your own experience, but especially, of course, linguistic constraints are always going to matter to some degree, and that frames to some degree the kind of cases that you choose, right? So I think one element of the book is that a lot of cases are to some degree linked back to Friedrich List and to German ideas of the late 19th century, early 19th century, and also of the 20th century. And that, I think, provides some kind of narrative arc as well, especially for the earlier 2/3 of the book, because these are sources that I'm generally more and more familiar with. In general, of course, this builds on massive work by other people. I mean, it is the amount of excellent scholarship that kind of went into this, in a way, sausage machine is absolutely stunning. And sometimes these are other kind of overarching works, but I found that most useful in terms of secondary sources were really often quite specific local histories of particular patterns of consumption, of the history behind a particular tariff rate that may by themselves not always make the most stimulating reading, but that are absolutely essential, I think, in order to understand this picture. And then to link this together with the primary source, which in this case are largely the works written by those thinkers that I examine. Again, this is largely discourse analysis. And one way of choosing, I think, the cases that I examined in this book, apart from, again, familiarity with sources and context, is the degree to which they illuminate a particular theme, right? So there are particular themes in the book, such as, for example, the way that nationalists think about the environment, the relationship between economic nationalism and democracy or autocracy, that provides of selective criteria. So there is, at the end of the chapter on the interwar period, there is a comparative section on fascist Italy, on kind of corporatist Romania and the interwar period, and then Brazil under the Estado Novo, where the organizing theme is how economic nationalists resorted to autocratic modes of governance in order to kind of build national economies. And so this kind of selection of themes, I think, is important. And I guess this to some degree answers the historiographical point, right? So this, I see this really as, in a way, an aggregation or an reinterpretation of large bodies of existing scholarships.
Thank you. Eric?
Thank you. There's a lot in this book, and you cover considerable geographical and chronological territory here. But I want to focus on the more recent period that you address in the final chapter and conclusion of the book. And what I'm thinking about is the way in which certain terms, in this case, your theme of economic nationalism, can be applied to very, very, very different things. And so when I think about the last quarter century, say, in the United States, thinking about the utility of economic nationalism for both the left and the right, and for both groups, the definition of economic nationalism seems very different. Its purposes are very different. The left is concerned with reducing inequality. It is concerned, or rather open to immigration from everywhere. On the other side, on the right, there seems to be an indifference to issues of inequality and maybe more of an emphasis on growth, and certainly a hostility to immigration. So if Trump on the right and Sanders, Warren on the left all embrace some version of economic nationalism, but that economic nationalism does look rather different, is that the best term then to describe what it is that they're seeking to accomplish?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think it is one way of describing what they're seeking to accomplish. It's certainly not the only one, right? So I would not view this as, an exclusive label and say this explains everything that these people are doing and thinking, etc. I think it is economic nationalism best viewed as one lens through which, we can view the motivations of actors, and it sheds light on some of the things they want, some of the things that they want but can't do, and some of the conflicts that arise from that. And it will be quite useless in illuminating certain other elements, right? So I think that is important to state, right? Because it's, you often run into the danger otherwise if you spend a lot of years working on this subject that you have a hammer in your hand and you're just desperately looking for nails to whack it on. And I think we have to be careful here. I think when it comes to the appeal to left and right, I think this is something that struck me when I worked on this book. That I'd kind of gone into this project, I think, more or less explicitly with, okay, this is going to really, to some degree, be a history of right-wing movements, right? And then it turned out that was still the case to some degree, but it's the case to a lesser degree than I envisaged before, because it then turned out that often left-wing movements will also make arguments that fit into this nationalist mold to some degree. Now, again, this, I think, has a lot to do with focus on inequality, because many types of nationalists are concerned about inequality. Now, the solutions that they propose may differ, but in a sense, both Trump's rhetoric, although, again, probably not in his actual policy implementation, and Sanders' appeal to Midwestern industrial states kind of are based on a feeling or the supposition that the exposure of the US economy over the past two decades, in particular when it comes to import competition from China, has accentuated inequality, right, within the American nation, and that this is tearing the nation apart to some degree. Right? Now, of course, what differs quite radically is the definition of the nation itself. Right? And I think this is always important to emphasize that, of course, nationalists will differ quite radically on whom they deem to be part of the nation and whom they try to exclude from the nation. And I think this is another very important point that I think Erica touched upon as well when she talked about those racialized hierarchies, and they are important for many economic nationalists, not for all of them, but for many nationalists they are important. They are often seen as, or have historically often been seen as, an integral part of building a national economy to exclude people of different religions, different ethnic backgrounds from this national economy. So I think that's another important aspect.
So a quick follow-up. So if you could say a bit more about the ethno-cultural dimension that you write about in the book, and correct me in my take on, let's say, 2016 onward, or at least to 2020. And so I'm thinking that sometimes the relationship between economic nationalism and the ethnocultural dimension that you write about, where the two are balanced or which one weighs heavier. Am I wrong in thinking that for all of the China bashing and the tariffs that the Trump administration championed, the concern was in part more about the ethno-cultural dimension? The programs that are advanced in that administration do not address internal inequality, particularly tax reform, tax cuts seem to exacerbate that inequality. There's no rebuilding of steel mills or reopening of coal mines. So it's almost as if the economic nationalist dimension is in service of a political project that seems to be more about accumulating and exercising political power than it is addressing the actual issues there. So there's a lot I just threw out in what I promised would be a short question. My apologies. But anyhow, any thoughts?
Yeah, so the way that I would characterize is probably along those lines, in the sense that there is, of course, a long-standing tradition of economic nationalism within the US about accentuating, worrying about the decline of manufacturing, etc., and then thinking about how different interventions, including tariffs, and now we're more into industrial policy and subsidies today, using the tax code, etc., could remedy those. So that's definitely a tradition that was important, I think, for 2016. But as you say, it was probably those groups that I think were mobilized by those ideas were probably not weighty enough to actually carry the day in the end, right? So I think what we view here in 2016 really is an alliance between this kind of long-standing economic nationalism tradition and this kind of hyped up anti-wokerism culture warriors that often have a very strong ethno-national dimension. Right? And the weights between those different camps, they shift a little bit over time. They are also, I would say, quite fluid. There are individuals that can transition between those camps, and you can have, of course, the same individual in both camps. But it is, I think, in essence, an alliance of affiliated groupings, right, where probably none of those groups by themselves could have achieved that at the level of electoral success. I think that is a general feature of economic nationalism, but sometimes it's in the driving seat, but it can also be an auxiliary force. Right? It is not necessarily everywhere and always the decisive factor.
Thank you.
Great. Megan Easley Walsh is bringing us back to the beginning of the story. She is wondering about the starting point of 1776. Is it inspired by the publishing of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, or fledgling America with the Declaration of Independence and the national struggles that followed this, or something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it is largely inspired by the US, right? So this is the first kind of substantive chapter in the book where I look at different ideas for nation building and economy building in the early US, and then on how that played out. Of course, to some degree, the starting date really for any history is a bit arbitrary, right? And I think another interesting dimension is that there are, of course, patterns of thought that carry over from earlier, what one might sometimes call a mercantilist era, into this era of economic nationalism more properly. Right? This is something that you also see in the early US, where many early economic nationalists make arguments that sit both within late mercantilist traditions as well as within early nationalist traditions.
Thank you. My comment function is jumping around a bit, so it's hard for me to read some of the other. Jamie Martinez is asking, thank you for the great ideas discussed. Could you say that nationalists moved to globalization when it served it well? And now that it does not, they recede from it. The US promoted free trade and lately setting some barriers under various justifications.
I think that's a fair characterization in the sense. I think one of the things that the book tries to do, it tries to push back a little bit against overly simplified conceptions of economic nationalism, which conceptualizes those nationalists as just, always opposed to globalization and integration, etc. Rather, I would see most nationalists, again, not all of them, but most nationalists who think about economic matters as being in many cases essentially quite pragmatic and taking what I might call a kind of pick and mix approach to globalization, or kind of globalization a la carte. I think I call it somewhere in the book, where you really try and maximize the benefits from certain international engagements, right? Again, you try to attract some multinational firms in particular sectors where you think their technology is useful, but then you try to shut them out from other sectors, which you call strategic sectors, and they're off limits to multinational companies. Right? Or similarly, if you think about migration, right? That you shut out certain migrants, but you encourage other migrants with high human capital, high skills, which you think will contribute to the national economy to some degree to come. So this is, I think, an apt characterization of economic nationalism as trying to manage globalization in a way.
Thank you. We have I'd like to call on Dane Kennedy for his question. Dane, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. This is fascinating, and I'm in the midst of reading Quinn Slobodian's book, The Globalists, which is about the rise of neoliberalism, and which argues that in fact this neoliberalism wasn't simply a call for a free market and no economic restraints, but rather an attack on economic nationalism, I suppose one could say, and an argument for a more sort of globalized system of economic order. And I'm just wondering sort of how the people you study fit into, obviously in contradiction to this, but I don't have a precise question, but I wonder if you could speak to your book in connection with the arguments that Slobodian makes.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, because we often think about, those, again, the great liberalizations of, the 80s and 90s as effectively dismantling, the socialist planned economies of the former Soviet Union and China. But in many ways, they were directed, I would argue, to an equal degree against, the nationalist economies of post-colonial Africa, against those models of the East Asian developmental state, against those developmentalist models in Latin America, etc. And when it comes to international institutions, I think there, again, of course, as you mentioned, to some degree, there's this opposition, but in other senses, there are also cases when nationalists have used international institutions to some degree to their advantage. So one section that, unfortunately, just because of space constraints, I had to edit out of the book, but was kind of, would have spoken to that particular point, was about Latin American nationalists of the post-World War II period. Right, where you have, for example, the Mexican government, very explicitly makes this argument that, we want to build a national economy, we want some degree of protection, etc. But we're a rather small economy in the end. So one thing that we can do is we can try and change the institutions at the global level to try and make our national paths of development easier. Right? So rather than seeing themselves in a way as the recipients or the just victims or subjects of global institutions, so such as the IMF, trying to actually take them over and reform them.
Mm-hmm. Donald Rogers has a question that goes a little bit in the same direction. He wonders if economic nationalist ideas had a regional dimension, where in certain regions, the global south, found those ideas especially attractive versus other regions.
Yes, so the regionalist dimension is really important. So I make the argument as well in the book that regional integration is one potential outcome of this nationalist dilemma. And it's something that goes, again, really back to List and in his writing, where List says, okay, yes, you want protection as an economic nationalist, but you also want growth. And that's going to be easier if you're a larger economy. And that is one of the reasons, he says, why the US can grow so fast under protection, because they're very big, right? They have loads of land, they have loads of markets, etc. So one thing that you can do is regional integration. You can actually cooperate, band together with neighboring countries. In this case, you enlarge your market, you enlarge your reach of resources, and you can then still have protection, just that this protective barrier will be around your common union. And those arguments are used by Pan-Africanists in post-colonial Africa. Again, say, Ghana by itself, Tanzania by itself is a very small country. If we band together, we can have a unified continent, a kind of an African economic area that can adequately protect its resources, its markets from encroachment by global institutions, multinational firms, etc. So that's something that is powerful in a Pan-Africanist context, and again also in a Latin American context in the post-World War world.
Thank you. A final short question: is Coca-Cola colonialism another one of these ghost others in trying to reject consuming a foreign product? Quick question, since we're coming to the end of our time. Quick answer.
I think it's often seen that way, of course, by especially in cases where anti-colonialism, anti-imperialist ideas and nationalist ideas intersect. So I look at the case of Bolivia in the 2000s, the government of Evo Morales, and of course they very much make these kind of arguments. Yeah.
Great. Well, Marvin, Eric, what a great conversation this was. Thank you so much for contributing to the Washington History Seminar. Unfortunately, we do have to adjourn now. I'll turn it over to Eric for final words.
And my thanks as well to Marvin, Erica, and Christian. And we hope to see everyone in the audience again next Monday on December 4th, when the Washington History Seminar returns to discuss Sarah Percy's new book, Forgotten Warriors: The Long History of Women in Combat. Till then, take care. Good night.